because I thought she was giving me the microphone. Am I here? I can't do anything without Ellen. Hello, everyone. Oh, come on now. Hello, everyone. Hello. What do you guys think? Was that rousing?
One more time.
One more time. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hey, you're back. Is it Cody? Yes. All right. I'm Jami. All right, I'm Jami Floyd. Welcome to the Green Space. We're in partnership with Echoing Green tonight. Welcome to new people who've come to join us. Welcome back to Cody, who was here last night. Cody, are you an Echoing Green person? Oh, we're so pleased that you've come 2 nights in a row. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll get you here all 4 nights. All right, we shall see. Tonight is our night with a focus on criminal justice. And I want to thank Echoing Green for partnering with us. I want to thank all of you for coming out on a cold, though warming, winter night. Is it getting warmer out there? Yes. I want to thank you, though, because who wants to come out on a winter night? But this issue is critically important, and we know it is, and that's why all of you are here. It's 2017, new year, soon to be new president, and critically important, but not new issues in criminal justice. And this is why we need to come together collectively in our country to deal with these issues. And we are bringing together this week the brightest minds, with Echoing Green's help, to address these important issues. And tonight's issue is criminal justice. We're calling this Solutions Week, and these 3 brilliant people are going to help us come up with some solutions. So without further ado, let me introduce them. Gina Clayton is the founder of Essie Justice Group. Essie is a group that works with women who are hardest hit by the impact of mass incarceration through programs that restore family unity and safety. And Gina is going to make a presentation in a moment laying out the challenges that she and Essie seek to address, as well as the solutions. Glenn Martin is the founder of JustLeadershipUSA, an advocacy organization that hopes to cut the prison population in half by the year 2030. 2030. And in a moment, he will tell us how he sees that challenge and seeks to address it. And Deanna Van Buren is co-founder of Designing Justice and Designing Space. Is it and Designing Spaces or plus Designing Spaces?
The plus is silent. You just leave that.
Okay, so let me try it again. Designing Justice, Designing Spaces.
Excellent.
All right now. Which works with communities, including inmates, to design and develop buildings that integrate restorative justice, economics, and reentry housing. It is an amazing thing, and we're going to hear all about it in just a moment. So we're going to begin with the statements of the fellows. First, the challenges as they see them. Because to work at the solutions, we really first have to understand the problems. And so we asked each fellow to respond to what is just going to sound like such a basic question, right? We were talking about it back in the green room, here in the green space, with the Echoing Green fellows. And Gina Clayton, I'm going to ask you to begin first as the founder of Essie Justice Group. How does racial inequality affect access to justice? And you already warned me you're just going to answer your own question. So go right ahead.
That's true, but I think it's very related. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm the founder of Essie Justice Group, which is an organization that is harnessing the collective power of women with incarcerated loved ones to build a loving and powerful community of women with incarcerated family members and friends to end mass incarceration's harm to women across this country. I want to answer your question, Jami, through telling you a little bit about a woman named Sandria, who is somebody who I met very early on when I was working at a public defense office in Harlem, New York. At the time when I met her, she had been living in her apartment for 20 years, and she was a model tenant. She never paid a rent bill late. She had never caused any disruption. Yet she sat in front of me in that office that day because she was being evicted. And the reason why she was being evicted was because her grandson had been arrested blocks away from her apartment. Now, he didn't live with her, but on that night that he was arrested, his arresting officer asked for an address. And this 17-year-old, frightened young man told his arresting officer about her address. He told them his grandmother's address. And that case had not even been adjudicated against him. He had not been proven guilty of anything. Yet she ended up being put in eviction proceedings and on the verge of losing her home of 20 years and her housing of last resort. She was in New York City's public housing. And we won that case, and I'm proud to say that we won that case and many like it. But what was significant for me about that case wasn't just the ending, but it was the beginning. Because at the very beginning of that case, she asked me a question that I would come to hear over and over and over again from other clients. And that was, Gina, how much time do you think that you can get me before I have to move out? And this question broke my heart, because here was a woman who was the backbone of her family and the linchpin of a community. And because of the thickness of the stigma and the shame and the humiliation that she felt, she was not preparing for a fight. She was preparing for a surrender. And so what I ended up telling Sandria and clients like her after, to kind of transform, to change the positionality from surrender to fight in those moments, was a very simple message. And that was, you are not alone. In fact, 1 in 4 women in the United States today has a family member in prison. For Black women, nearly 1 in 2 of us has a family member in prison. And I would explain to Sandria, my clients, that millions of families, millions of women know what this is like and have experienced or are experiencing this very same thing. And I would explain that I myself had become a woman with an incarcerated loved one when I too, in my first year of law school, experienced the incarceration of someone who I loved when he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Now, this strategy worked as a strategy to fight cases. This solution worked as a solution in my casework, but I consider myself a student of social change, and as a student of social change, I was ultimately in search of solutions that would end the system of oppression that allows for mass incarceration to exist and persist. And as many have pointed out, social movement does not happen without mobilized women. 2/3 of the Black Panther Party were women. The mothers of the disappeared in Argentina captivated the world through their actions assembling on the plaza to demand that the state bring back their disappeared. Even organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and others have transformed laws and policies and social attitudes in a way that's been completely catalytic. But in this age of mass incarceration, Black and brown women in particular are under an insidious attack, an attack that is silencing millions of women and removing them from the conversation and removing them from a movement. Mass incarceration has resulted in a large-scale social isolation of Black and brown women, and the removal of family members and the systemic attack that leads to the uprooting of Black and brown women, state violence against them, is not new. And I'll just end by sharing my great-grandmother. Her name was Essie, and it is where the name Essie Justice Group comes from. She passed away a month after I took Sandria's case, and she grew up in Louisiana on a sharecropping farm and moved, like many women of her race and generation, from south to west in the Great Migration in search of opportunities, freedom from Jim Crow, from sexism, from racism, and from poverty. And she was able to build, despite all of these barriers, she was able to build a foundation upon which I stand and upon which many of my family members stand today. And I, grew up with her. I grew up hearing her stories and talking to her frequently and really being raised by her in many ways. And when I went home after I'm from California. And I went home after a period of time working in Harlem, and I went to my grandmother's house, and I went to ask her for her blessing to use the name Essie for this organization. But I also wanted to understand, as I was building solutions, I wanted to understand what were the solutions that my great-grandmother employed. And so I asked her really simply, I said, Grandma, how did she do it? We called Essie Grandmom. I said, how did Grandmom do it? And she said, she looked at me like I was crazy. She said, baby, she had sisters. And that was it. That was the aha moment that led to the solution and the strategy for Essie Justice Group. We are creating a sisterhood of social justice to end mass incarceration. We have since then developed a 9-week healing to advocacy program that brings women together from isolation and brings them into advocacy spaces. We've seen women go to Sacramento, to Washington, D.C., take on major campaigns. We're taking on the bail industry this year, and so forth. And so our solution is not particularly innovative. Sorry, echoing green. It's ancestral. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you to Echoing Green and WNYC. Echoing Green invested in JustLeadershipUSA when it was in conceptual phase, if you will. In fact, when I heard you introduce me, you said the mission statement, and you talked about cutting the number of people in prison in half by 2030. And we haven't said that for a long time at Just Leadership. We actually now talk about cutting the number of people under correctional supervision in half by 2030 because we've evolved to recognize that the carceral state it goes so much further than just incarcerating the human body, and that in this country, the deprivation of liberty is just the beginning of punishment, and that people are punished for the rest of their lives, whether it's under parole, supervision, probation, electronic monitoring, or just the plethora of statutory or practical barriers that people face based solely on having a criminal record. What am I going to talk about this evening? I don't even remember the question I'm going to answer. I was going to pivot anyhow. We're at WNYC. I could pivot my ass off. So I am going to talk about one of our local initiatives. So nationally, we train formerly incarcerated leaders as a solution to mass incarceration. I served 6 years in prison here in New York State. While I sat in prison on a robbery conviction, I found myself surrounded by some of America's best and brightest, and it didn't fit the narrative that I've been taught my entire life about who ends up going to prison. I know it didn't fit the narrative about who I was, but that was confirmed during those years in prison. And in particular, serving a year on Rikers Island is something that stayed with me and never went away. And I'll tell you a little bit about that story before I'll tell you about the Close Rikers campaign and the evolution of that particular campaign. When I was 16 years old, I got arrested for shoplifting here in New York City. In New York State, we're one of only 2 states that charge 16-year-olds as adults and send them into the adult criminal justice system. And I ended up at Rikers Island with $1,500 bail. And I was only going to be there 2 days, but on the second day, I was on my way back to court, and I was in a cell, and a child, we're all 16, we're children, I'm using those words very deliberately, said to me, give me your jacket. And on Rikers Island, if you know anything about the culture, they don't call it gladiator school for nothing. You have 2 choices, predator or prey, and you need to decide really quickly. And so we started fighting in the cell, and before it was over, I was fighting 5 people, and I was stabbed in my neck and back with a pen similar to this one. And as difficult as that was, I emerged from that fight knowing I'd be able to survive on Rikers. But what was more difficult was the correction officers in the background snickering and telling me that if I wanted medical help, that I would be labeled as a snitch and I wouldn't get to go to court that day. I spent a year at Rikers a few years later, and not only did I get to know the culture, but I became part of the culture. I learned how to survive and probably became part of the problem on Rikers. But what I learned during that year is that the level of corruption that exists on Rikers Island is something that is ingrained, and that the problem with Rikers is Rikers. And it's anywhere from correction officers killing people, and we've all heard the stories if you read the Daily News, the Post, the New York Times, to things that seem relatively innocuous. I mean, an officer would take me out of my cell, take me to his office, show me his work, ask me to do his work, clean off his desk, go to sleep, lock the door, wake up the next day, put me back in the cell. Well, I grew up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, not the Bed-Stuy we all know today, the Bed-Stuy do or die for people who are longtime New Yorkers. And I had never seen anywhere near the level of corruption in my community that I saw sitting in a place that was defined as a correctional institution. And that always stuck with me, particularly when I got to state prison. And after all the violence I saw in Rikers, I remember seeing a guy opening a can of soup when I got there, and he took the top off. And I was thinking to myself, wow, that's a pretty sharp razor blade. And he took it and he threw it in the garbage and he ate soup. And it just struck me again and solidified for me and crystallized that, again, the problem with Rikers is Rikers and the longstanding culture and the fact that it was bought by New York City from a gentleman named Riker, who was a slave owner and who helped to capture slaves here in New York City, and that it has this culture of violence that is just not going away. And so fast forward, I get out of prison and I'm like any other formerly incarcerated person facing a tremendous amount of barriers to reentry, and I land a job just up the block here, in fact, at a place called the Legal Action Center, answering the phone at the front desk for $17,000 a year, but owing about $100,000 in fines, fees, and restitution. And yet finding myself at a civil rights organization surrounded by some of the most effective civil rights attorneys I've met to date, and having them invest in me and watching me go from this formerly incarcerated person trying to figure out what's next in his life, but having this lingering thought about those amazing people that I met in prison, to one day sitting and having audience with the President of the United States to talk about these issues. And the more I became successful, the more I said to myself, well, the more people can point to Glenn and say he's the exception, is the more we actually contribute to the existing narrative about who's in prison. And I said to myself, as well as I'm doing 13 years later, I'd be remiss if I didn't use that power and privilege that I had gained to invest in other people, because I knew the truth, which is that most of the people who I met in prison, were they exposed to exceptional opportunities, they'd be defined as the exception also. And so when I built this organization, we decided to not just be ambitious nationally, but to launch this ambitious local campaign, which said, you can't continue to invest in a place that turns out so much human carnage so steadily after so many mayors before you have invested so much in this place. And we set the North Star much higher than anyone else. We said, reform is important for the people that are there on any given day, but let's shoot towards closing the facility down. And it was a joke. People would call me up. They say, Glenn, you're out of your mind. I mean, I told the mayor, I was at his inauguration, Mayor de Blasio, with all due respect, you should close Rikers. People laughed about it. But being at Echo and Green, I was in a space where I realized that if you believe in something bold and audacious and no one else believes in it in that moment, or not many people, you're probably in the right place. And I knew I was in the right place because people were telling me that it was impossible. And here it is, a year since we launched this campaign. I mean, not only is it possible, but the governor is saying we should close it. The speaker of the council is saying we should close it. The comptroller is saying we should close it. And probably most importantly, thousands of people who've been harmed by Rikers are saying we should close it. And yet, the reason I started with the story of Rikers Island is, one, because we're sitting here in New York City, and I know we're going to get to solutions in a second. But two, because I took my direction from people who've been most impacted by the system. And what I heard loud and clear is that the incrementalism that people have been seeing in the space of criminal justice reform just was not enough. And I hope that's going to be the theme of our conversation this evening, is to be bold and audacious so that solutions match the scope of the problem, and at the same time, not having the average person feel daunted by the concept of mass incarceration to the point where they're paralyzed. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Deanna Van Buren, designing justice, designing spaces.
Correct. So I'm an architect, so I'm also going to pivot a little bit on the question because it's a little bit different what we do, but I'm very honored to be on this panel. It's really amazing to be included. And, I'll start with a kind of a meta context for us. We have to sort of understand that the built environment that we're living in, this container that holds our lives, has been really in the control of the wealthy and the elite since before the pyramids, like forever. Our president is a real estate developer. Sorry, president-elect, he's not quite there yet, but he is a real estate developer. So when we start to look at structural inequity, racial inequity, there's a direct link to our built environment that actually exacerbates and echoes and reverberates all of the bad policy, all the bad thinking we have about ourselves. So, we can kind of look at the last century and see how it's connected to what's happening now. So we have redlining, for example, where lines were drawn around communities of color for disinvestment. African American people could not own their own home. They could not start businesses. They could not continue their businesses. And as jobs left, there was nothing left in that community besides the corner store, the liquor store. We still see that, still like that. We start to see inappropriate uses located, or nasty uses located in those communities. Those might be wastewater treatment plants, dumps, oil refineries. It's what's happening at Standing Rock right now. We start to see huge swaths of low-income, high-rise housing that actually damage the socioeconomic health of that community. So now your physical health has been impacted by the uses, and now so is your life, your social life, the fabric of your families and your community. And then we see suburbia sold and marketed to white folks to leave the cities as people of color are entering into the urban core. And so we see all this happening. And at the same time, we see another infrastructure being built that's directly related to people of color, which is our prison industrial complex. So we see a boom in the building of prisons and jails and courthouses and detention centers that adjudicate and house Black and brown bodies. So it's a bit of a cluster, you know what, right? So it's all happening at the same time. And so in our profession, there are not a lot of people of color. There just aren't a lot of us. I'm an architect. My business partner, Kyle Rollins, is a real estate developer. Nobody's really caring or thinking about these issues from the context of race, structural racism. So, I had always been told as a young person by my dad, he's here too, my parents are here, that you could not trust the justice system, that you should stay well outside of it, don't go anywhere near it, don't even get a divorce. Don't even go that part, because it's not for you. This is not for you. My uncle was murdered. Nobody said anything. Nothing happened. That happened when I was very young. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to do anything about it. It's just not safe. So I grew up thinking and being afraid of police, being afraid of literally buildings that house that. So when I heard about restorative justice from Fania Davis and Angela Davis, civil rights, I got goosebumps. I was like, you know what? That justice is for me. A justice that actually seeks to repair the harm done, that really acknowledges the victim and the person who did the harm, and giving people a chance to make amends. And what would that look like? And architects have always also been in the agency of the wealthy, tagging along behind, building their things for them. And so what would it look like for us to support alternative justice systems? Would it look like to empower and engage people of color in the agency around their own environment? So designing justice, designing spaces is set up to do that. And our mission is to use the built environment to end mass incarceration and support the rise of restorative justice and restorative economics practices. And so I want to be really clear on this point. We are not designing prettier boxes to house people. We are not designing prettier prisons and jails, or like the gentleman thought last night, what do you think we're doing? Refugee camps. I was like, no, dude. You have to expand your mind. We're trying to create, and we are creating new building types, revitalizing old ones, working with communities to both design and create these places and tools that will help our communities to heal and to thrive. And so let me tell you what those might be. They are peacemaking centers for conflict resolution between those who have harmed and those who have done the harm. The restorative justice, restorative economic centers. Have you ever even heard of that before? Who's been in a peacemaking center before? Anybody? We got one. Soon everybody's going to raise their hand on that one, because they're going to be everywhere. These are the places we need to make. Reentry housing for those reentering their communities from prison and jail. Housing for youth transitioning out of foster care so they don't go to prison and jail. We're creating pop-up resource villages that support micro-entrepreneurship in low-income communities. We're stripping back buses and turning them into the classrooms, into refuge centers for women. It's kind of like a 360-degree desperation in some ways to really address the structural inequity and the racial inequity that is so deeply embedded in our built environment. It's all around us. So it's hard to thrive when you're not able to live in an environment that supports your economic and social health. So I will say two more things. The first is that we have to be very innovative in our built environment. We have to be careful about what we build. You have to also do that with people, and we also need to look at our not in my backyard attitudes that actually facilitate this. And so, as we move forward, I always tell people you can change policy, you can even change your politicians, but the stuff that you build sometimes lasts forever. outlast your lifetime and mine. And so as you attempt to change the philosophies and the beliefs of society, literally your physical infrastructure locks you into the old ones, and you can't move ahead. So, what Gina was saying about the grandmother, if she owned her apartment, that would not be a problem, right? If she actually had some agency and ownership in her community, that wouldn't happen. And so if we really value Black and brown lives, we have to build for that. We have to build for that so it lasts well beyond the pyramids. Yeah, thank you.
Did any of you hear anything here that surprised you, that you hadn't heard before, that you didn't know about one another before you sat here in this last, 15 minutes or so?
I'll jump in. So I've heard both these women speak in the past. What resonated with me and what struck me was Gina telling her story of empowering women who have loved ones who've been involved in the criminal justice system, and how I could have just replaced a few words within her statements, and it sounded very similar to the work we're doing to support the people who've actually served time in the system and under other forms of criminal justice supervision, which reinforces for me that if we continue to have these conversations as if we're talking about some small group of people that did something wrong that we need to figure out what to do with, then we're not coming up with solutions that match the scope of the problem or how we got here. In prison, we say prison is where we send bad people who do bad things. I say, then where do we send good people who do bad things? Mm-hmm. Because I met some really amazing people in there. But then those really amazing people, those 70 million Americans that now have a criminal record on file, they're all connected to similarly powerful and amazing people who I believe if we're trying to build a movement, then it would be insane for us to silo that movement when there are so many others who are connected to the system in one way or another. And then the conversation about architecture, we had a conversation recently and some of this came up, but you talked about how we build things that outlast us. And people say to me, well, Glenn, can't we just reform what we already have on Rikers Island? But what a lot of people don't realize is Rikers Island, first of all, is 200 feet away from LaGuardia Airport. A lot of people don't realize that. And if you build a jail next to an airport, then it ends up being built antithetical to how you would build a safe jail, whether it be for detainees or for even the officers that are in that jail. And so, no, it doesn't matter how many millions you pour into Rikers. Bill de Blasio has poured in over $500 million in the short time he's been in office, in addition to the $209,000 per bed per year that we already spend, and he keeps getting the same outcomes. In fact, violence has actually been on the increase. The population has gone down by half, the budget has gone up double, and he wonders why he keeps doing the same thing and getting the same outcome. A big part of it is literally the architecture. From the beginning, it was built in response to mass incarceration. And when you think of all the things that sits upon, the foundation of it, whether it be racism, sexism, classism, all of those sort of things, we essentially now have structures that are meant, I would argue, for a different time.
Right. I heard a moving and common thread of optimism in the face of what many people feel is an intractable and daunting, overwhelming problem. And we talked in the back about the paralysis many people feel, but I heard optimism. So with that, in that spirit, do you agree? Do you all agree?
Absolutely.
I agree.
Totally.
Feeling optimistic? Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair word?
It is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Move to action, obviously, because you're social entrepreneurs. So with that in mind, let's start talking about the solutions. And everyone in this room has received a postcard. Cody, you know the drill. I could even ask you to explain, but I won't. Don't worry. Everybody has a postcard. And it has what we call a 3x10 commitment. I don't have one to demonstrate, but our panelists can. Hold that on up. Anybody not have the postcard? You should have received it in the Hillary, you didn't get the postcard? You know I'm going to call you out, girl. Can somebody please give my friend a postcard? Another person over here without a postcard. The postcards are coming around. And we are going to explain to you about the 3x10 commitment, but I am not going to do that. Jana Oberdorf is going to do that. Stand up.
Yeah, I'm prepared tonight for you.
You were prepared. You did it. Did she do a good job, Cody, yesterday? You certainly did. Jana, tell us a little bit about, I don't think, Ellen, did we introduce Jana? I don't think we did. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Jana is responsible for bringing this series to WNYC and linking us up with Echoing Green. And tell us all about you and the folks at home. And then also explain to us about 3x10 commitments, whether they work, of course they do or we wouldn't be doing them, why they work, and if you care to share your commitment, please do so.
So hi everyone, I'm Jana Oberdorf and I run communications for Echoing Green, which means I get to be around and support the incredible, inspiring social entrepreneurs like the three on stage and the many more in our community of 700 and more. So one of the things that we're asking people to do this week, as we really try to think about this as a solutions week, to try to think optimistically, is to think about commitments you can make in 10 days, 10 weeks, and 10 months. And really what this is trying to do is get your brain working towards what are commitments you can make in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And what we find is sometimes the short term is really easy for people. Sometimes the long term is really easy for people. But I really challenge you to think about, can you make a commitment now in the near future and in the farther future that you can hold yourself accountable to and check back. In 10 weeks, did you do the thing you said you were going to do? In 10 months, did you commit and did you achieve it? And so this is our sort of call on you to be a part of the solution and to hold yourself accountable as a member of the solution.
It's a calling card.
It's a calling card. And Jami forced me to do one for myself, so I'm not getting out of this either.
No.
So my commitment in 10 weeks is to start the conversation in my own home. So I had the opportunity to watch the film 13th, which features Glenn and Gina and several other Echoing Green fellows, and is incredibly informative. I learned so much by watching it, and I got to hear some of our fellows talk about their work within the context of that film. And so my commitment is to bring that film into my own home, into my own family, into my own community, and to start the conversation there as well.
Where the conversation may be challenging.
Where the conversation may be challenging.
Thank you. And the idea is to keep the card as a reminder of the commitments that you've made. And last night, people shared their commitments with us, and so we're hoping you will do the same tonight. Some of you. We're not going to... Well, I actually did call on people. Maybe I'll do the same tonight. But I want to ask our fellows, while you think and begin to write down your commitments, and we're asking you to do it on the challenge we're talking about tonight, the criminal justice challenge in this country, at this time as we head into a new era with a new president. I want to ask the fellows how you think this approach works, asking people who may have nothing to do with the criminal justice system. You know, they may feel, well, this is beyond me. I'm not a public defender. I'm not an Echoing Green fellow. I do my jury duty because I know everybody in this room does their jury duty. They don't try and skip out. But beyond that, what can I do? Do you think this kind of 3x10 commitment is a good approach for the average citizen to take if they're not engaged to the level that you all are?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I, like Glenn and Deanna, I don't know how far along in your project you were when you applied for Echoing Green money, but there were a lot of people who were saying that what we were setting out to do was impossible. And it's amazing to look back at some of those written documents, those statements of commitment, and see how many of those manifested. And I truly believe the act of writing them down of intention setting was what made that difference. And Echoing Green's all about it. And I think if we could scale that, I mean, huge.
And at the end, we're going to ask all of you three to ask the folks in this audience and beyond what you need from them for your organizations. But how about those who may be not just regular folks like me, but folks who may be interested in social entrepreneurship? How do you get focused? How do you make a plan? How do you, because it can be, I mean, we're trying to be optimistic, but it can be overwhelming. You might have, 30 different things you want to do, even in this one area that needs change. And we're talking about 4 different areas just this week that need some changing. So thoughts for folks in the room who may want to apply for an Echoing Green Fellowship, who may want to get engaged at a higher level of social entrepreneurship?
I can jump in about how I started and what my big
Please.
moment was I had this idea, what if we made restorative justice centers? And people were like, oh, that's crazy. What is that? What is that? You're going to make those? No way. And then a kind of taking some time to really reflect about it, but then also having the courage to step out and speak about it, right? So open my mouth and talk to people about it in public, talk to my friends, I talk to my colleagues, and in a way, speaking truth to power, to what your idea is and to the thing that you believe in. I think writing isn't important, but I think you have to speak it and you have to say it into the universe. And you'll be very surprised what happens, and stay very open, because it may come and not look the way that you thought it would look, and it will be your opportunity to take the next step.
Yeah, I'll build on that. I think I can literally remember the moment where I decided that I was going to work on an idea that led to Just Leadership USA. It was a similar situation. I would say, leaders are expected to lead most when their knees are shaking. I remember being at City Hall with Mayor Bloomberg. There were about 4 of us and the mayor, and we were having a very friendly conversation, which was punctuated by a conversation about stop and frisk. And he said, Glenn, I know how you feel about stop and frisk, but think of how many black lives we've saved as a result of stop and frisk. And he said, isn't it important to save those lives, even if, some people are unhappy with the approach? And I remember looking over his shoulder and seeing some of my colleagues who were there in the room. And if they were doing something physical, I think it would have been like, just don't respond, let it go. And it was a moment where I had to ask myself, with about 2 seconds notice, was I going to respond to him in that moment? And, I said to him, Mr. Mayor, with all due respect, you can achieve public safety and protect people's civil rights all at the same time. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And it was not just difficult to say that to a person in such a position of power, but in the room with people who I report to, right? It was tied to my own life and income and so on. And when I saw I could survive that moment, I just said to myself, why stop now? Why not just keep going? And so if people are thinking about social entrepreneurship, go big or go home. Come up with ideas and visions and actions that make other people take pause. Eventually they won't. Eventually they'll catch up to you. But social entrepreneurs, I find, are way around the social justice curve. Right. And then people tend to catch up. And that's how it's been done historically. I mean, I didn't even have this insight back then, but if you look historically, what we tend to look back on now and romanticize as movements and sort of lay out the steps that happened, the truth is when people are in the middle of those things, they're messy and they're hard to identify what's happening, but there's always social entrepreneurs, if that's the terminology we're using now, that we're way ahead of everyone else in terms of their vision about what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of our fellows last night also said that she always feels that she's way ahead of her team and waiting for everyone to catch on up.
Yeah, like philanthropy.
Yeah. Anyone having a hard time coming up with their challenges? I won't ask you to discuss. I just want to know. Oh, everyone's written down with their commitments. I'm sorry. Everyone's written down their commitments?
Jami, can I also, if people need more time?
Please, go ahead.
I just, a part of the story that Glenn, I think you don't tell is that social entrepreneurs are at bottom listeners, and they're inquisitive. And Glenn is an incredible listener. And you choose to listen to the right people. And Deanna, I know you do the same thing, that you're talking and listening and engaging consistently with the people who are directly impacted by the problems that you're trying to solve. And so that's why when you get up and you have to do something scary, because this work is scary, it really is. And you rise to that occasion because you have the stories and the names and all of those people right there at your back and in your mind constantly to hold you accountable and to push you into those moments. And so I think that, my first step was really, in terms of building solutions, was to listen. I took an entire year after to my probably grandmother's confusion, quitting my job and just searching for answers about how to solve mass incarceration, talking to people, really listening and going around the country talking to women who had loved ones behind bars. And that was where the solutions were. It was inside St. Quentin that we came up with our nominations strategy, because it is directly impacted incarcerated men and women who see our community more than anyone else. They see women with incarcerated loved ones, so they are the ones now who lead us to that community.
Can you say a little more about the nomination strategy and how it works?
Sure. So at the very beginning, this was a question that a lot of funders would come and ask was, Gina, it's all well and good that you want to build this sisterhood for social justice and have a nationwide network to end mass incarceration built on the power of women, but how are you going to find these women? And I would just kind of offhandedly say, rest assured, didn't you hear me say 1 in 4? They're everywhere, But I knew deep down that this was a problem, because this issue is so, the stigma is so thick that no one is raising their hands to say, this is me. And the women who we're talking about organizing are so accustomed to putting themselves last. If it's not for their kids, or if it's not for, whoever they love who's inside, they're not going to necessarily come into that space and place and be there. And so we needed to figure out how were we going to get to women. And I was in St. Quentin on another unrelated program, and a man came up to me, and he said, he was incarcerated, he said, Gina, I heard about you and I heard about what you're trying to do. And I want to tell you about my daughter, because she is incredible. She is the reason why I get up every morning. She writes to me, she visits me, she is raising children, she is trying to go to school, and she makes me feel like I have community in here, and I want her to have community out there. I want you two to get in touch. Now, I can't write down her name, I can't do, but just remember her name, and I'm going to make sure you all get in touch. And I walked out of those gates that day thinking, not just about her, but thinking about him. What an incredibly revolutionary love gesture that was, to want to do for, despite his situation and condition, to want to do for and care for his family. It's a myth that people inside are not parenting, that people inside are not there for their families, or want to be in more ways than they already are. And so we tap into that love, and today, women with incarcerated loved ones are nominated by incarcerated men and women. They write letters to our program. We get handfuls of letters every single day. And we pick up the phone and we call each one of those women and we say, Miss Mitchell, I'm Gina Clayton. I'm a woman with an incarcerated loved one calling you from Essie Justice Group, and I'm calling you today because I have here a letter from your son, and he says that you are incredible. Do you have a moment? It would be okay if I could read to you what he says about you. And that's how we find our community.
That is beautiful. How you make those phone calls without crying, I don't know.
Too long. Too hard.
Okay, so what we want to do now is take your questions for the panel, and hopefully some of your commitments as you ask your questions, or if you just want to announce your commitments, that's fine too. I know there are probably a lot. Yesterday we had more questions than we had time for. Hopefully we can get to all of your questions, or many of your questions. So who wants to begin? Right here? Excellent. I'll come to you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lippy Roy. I'm an internal medicine and addiction medicine doctor at Correctional Health, New York City Health and Hospitals. So I spend half my time at Rikers Island. And something that each of you said has resonated with me. Ms. Clayton, I can't applaud you enough for the work that you do for women that are in the position they're at. So one of the only female inmate jail is called Rose M. Singer, Rosie's. And for the women there, one of my commitments in my position to coordinate addiction medicine efforts is to really approach this from a health angle. And for the women that are there, really continue providing other services such as yoga, meditation, and of course medications to assist with their, at least with their opioid addiction. And what's interesting is that the visitor center that's at Rikers, the visitors are women. And it's to whom we actually provide naloxone, which is the overdose antidote kit. But for the female inmates, they just don't really get visitors because they're the nucleus of these families. And for Mr. Martin, I can't applaud you enough for the work that you do. I've met you before. And, my goal, the other commitment that I have is probably my 10-week one, is to initiate a widespread education and training on addiction, not only to correctional health, but also to the Department of Correction. So I met with the Chief Murphy, Department of Correction, the big guy, and I said, Chief Murphy, I'd really like to offer this training to your officers. He said, look, we recognize that there are a lot of issues and problems with our, what we've got going, but I can promise you not a single officer wakes up in the morning wanting or planning to be violent. But hey, whatever you have to offer, we'd love to learn. So that's my commitment. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you for your commitments. She's in a position to actually make some commitments. That's good. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Questions? Oh, we've got a bunch in the front. That's fabulous. I can sit right down next to you. Yes, that would be better. Okay. And tell us who you are.
Sure. Hello. I'm Mary Joyce. This is my friend and coworker, Dolores. We're teachers in New Jersey. My 10-day commitment is actually we're organizing a screening of 13th for our high school students, which is kind of a big deal because of the topic and the content. It's a public school, and we're not an anti-racist community. We like to think we are, but collectively we're not. So it's our mission to start to...
I'm interrupting you, Joyce. Have you seen 13th?
Yes.
So do you mind my asking, you don't have to give me the name of the school, but do you mind my asking the community in which you teach?
Okay, we teach in Bergen County in New Jersey.
So say a little more about why you think it's important for the kids there to see 13th, and a little more about your impressions of the film and what you think they can learn from it. Okay.
So definitely, if you've already have this lens, it wasn't new information, but it was wonderfully done and weaved together, and it told, it had that thread of how it impacts quality of life indicators and every impact of our lives and the disparities that we see in society. It's relevant to schools. We have to be aware as educators how we perpetuate injustices inside the school that are happening outside of the school. White privilege, just the system of advantages that are designed to benefit those considered white. And we are a multiracial community in our school district, but we're not multicultural. We don't have an anti-racist lens. I'm not taking away anything. It used to be a very progressive town, but I think we've lost our way a little bit, and it's easy to deny and pretend we're colorblind, which that's an issue in and of itself. So it's starting to develop the capacity to learn as an organization. So we're starting with the screening. I've actually approached my administration to present at a faculty meeting, which is a big deal as well. I work with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They host an Undoing Racism workshop. Bigger than that, in 10 months, Dolores and I have a social enterprise that we started about 4 years ago called Right to Matter. It's called Right to Matter.
She's written a novel on her heart.
Dolores can speak more about it, but it is our response to the mass incarceration crisis. We both are women with loved ones who are formerly or currently incarcerated, and it's about communication, celebrating the talented artists that are there. We would like to purchase their artwork. We make greeting cards, and we would like to put them on the cover of greeting cards and celebrate and give them a platform and pay them for it. And it's just a bigger social mission. So hopefully through this event we can gain connections and see how we can move forward as a social enterprise.
Before you move on, I want everybody to give Joyce a big round of applause. Wow. I'm not a social entrepreneur or even a social worker. I do know, though, that they say if you take on too much, right? So, one thing at a time now. You got 10 days, you're going to do the screening. In 10 days?
On the 24th.
Oh, you already have the day. Okay, wow, I was going to say now. And then 10 weeks, you're going to do the faculty meeting.
Yes.
Do they know it's coming?
Yeah, well, the administrators do.
All right. And then you're going to do the rest of it. Wow. Okay, you go, girl. Next.
I'll be brief.
No, stand up. Don't be brief. Be brief.
Okay, yeah, I will.
That's right. But tell us who you are.
I'm Dolores Connors, and one thing that I am a teacher
Bravo.
that Mary
Bravo.
Joyce, thank you, probably didn't go into is our company. So we started about 4 years ago a company called Right to Matter, and it is a greeting card line that is established. And how we came to that company, and this is what drove us here so desperately today, is because we feel like we're not moving forward the way that we want to be. For 4 years, we've had this company. We were in school one day, and I teach reading, and I'll be brief. And a little girl, every Friday we have a reading talk, a book talk, and she pulled this book out every week. And I'm like, why did she pick that book? Why did she pick that book? So every week she's reading it quietly, independently. Friday is time for book talk. She raises her hand and she goes, Miss Connors, I want to share. And I'm like, she wants to share that book? So the book was Alcatraz, a little Read 180 scholastic pamphlet book that they created. And she began to tell her story about, Miss Connors, I really like this book because on page 9, it showed a picture of a cell. And she says, now I know what it looks like where my dad sleeps. Now we're in the middle of a circle, book crew. We have donuts, punch. And I'm like, oh boy, okay. I don't want her to tell too much of her business, but I wanted to give her dignity in what she wanted to share. And from that moment, I began to think about how many other kids don't share their peace. I mean, and it gets deeper than that. We have a colleague that got into a little bit of trouble. And this was an outstanding colleague who did so well. And when that person got in trouble, our colleagues did not know what to say or what to do. So our greeting card line came out of that need of people who need to be able to communicate with their loved ones. And our cards are for people who are dealing with that process. Because when your family member or the person you love gets in trouble, you still have to show up at work, right? But your church member knows your son got arrested. They don't want to mention it, but they want to say something. So the cards give the access to do that. But it's been 4 years, and we feel like we have a lot more cards than we have progress. So when we saw this, and we've seen Glenn before, and we really are so impressed. And Gina, we've heard about you, and Gina, this is the first time we're hearing about this, but we feel hopeful that we will move forward. Because what I hear from the three of you is that it was something of a seed that was in your mind, and look at how far you come today. So for us sitting here, I know we'll walk away like, okay, we can do it. But so I just want to say thank you for your commitment, and yeah, Mike 10. What
is the name of your company?
Right to Matter.
WRI. That's smart. Well, you sold 100 cards here tonight. Beautiful. Beautiful, right?
Absolutely.
I see a lot of tears. We got tears in the front row. I only cry once a year, so you didn't get me. I'm a journalist, you know. I can't cry every day or I'll be weeping. That was beautiful. And you came to the right place. And afterwards,
Yes,
I hope you don't mind my saying this, but I said it last night. Afterwards, come on up, right?
Please.
And talk about how to make it
partner.
happen. Because you're already doing it. You're
Yeah.
doing it. You just got to move it forward. And it's a beautiful mission. It's a beautiful mission, that story. Oh. Okay. All right, optimism. Optimism. Let's come on over here. Stand on up. Dolores, school teacher.
My name is James Jackson. I'm a freshman at Haverford College. And I happen to be in a place, at Haverford, which is a very progressive and very socially active community. But at the same time, we don't get to hear a lot of the opposing views. And I see a lot of both myself and my classmates turn to, as opposed to having a conversation with those that disagree with us, turn to bashing their opinions and ostracizing them and basically destroying any possibility of a real conversation. And that's what my commitments are surround. So starting productive conversations with those who agree, stop the ostracization of those who disagree, and to to change opinions or to hopefully facilitate that change and without bashing them. And I was just wondering, there must be quite a few times when each of the three of you are quite frustrated with somebody who does not have, a similar opinion to yours. And I was wondering what sort of things you guys like to do to sort of keep yourselves from, making them the bad guy.
That's a great question. It's not a coincidence that your last name's Jackson. You're sitting next to Emily. Is that your mom? Yeah? Okay. So there's the trolls, right? Like, I think of the trolls, people who try to push you on your values and your issues just to get a rise out of you and will never move, right? You have people that are sort of way over here and people that are way over here, and then the majority of Americans, I would argue, are actually in the movable middle, is what I call it. And as someone with a white father, a black mother, a father who was a police officer, an older brother who ended up being a correction officer, and now is a U.S. Marshal, I think of this work trying to use all of those lenses and listening to them, but also creating space for shared humanity and shared values. And I find if you open up a conversation around values, you at least have an in with people. Even if ultimately you don't define those values the same way, you at least don't start with sort of concrete, do you believe in this or not, in terms of your policy recommendations or anything. And that's worked for me. And the other thing is just not doing personal attacks. Like, I'm really good about attacking issues, but I'm also really good about not attacking people. And that has also worked for me. And it's not for everyone. And on the sort of scale of advocacy and how people approach the work, I do think there's value in people who take a more sort of revolutionary approach to the work, if you will. I don't devalue them. And at the same time, I just find that when you measure your work by the outcomes you produce, that you find yourself a little further over here, if you will, and willing to have conversations with people who might not share even the majority of your perspective. Before I started doing this work, I used to do legislative advocacy work, which requires support from both Republicans and Democrats, a lot of it here in New York State, but in a few other states around the country. And I just found that if you open up a conversation with something about family or something else where you can connect with people on a human level before you even dig into a conversation about policy. I used to walk into people's offices and look for pictures on the wall that tell me a little bit of something about the human being behind the sort of character that we all set up to live our lives. And it's just been successful. Not all the time. There's the trolls. But for the most part, it's actually helped me in my work over the last decade and a half.
Glenn, as we move forward into 2017 and post-inauguration, what do you do when you find yourself in a conversation that is devolving? And even though you may not employ personal attacks, what if they start coming your way? Or if you're in a room where others are employing that approach, how do you diffuse the situation?
Well, when they go low, we go high. I've been in a room with Senator Sessions and his staff in the past, and those conversations usually start out with the accusations of us being sort of left-leaning, lunatics. And yet at the same time, what I found was when I was able to sit with Senator Sessions and tell him about when I was in prison and when a correctional counselor said to me, Glenn, you should go to college, and then being sent to a prison 10 hours away from home and spending the entire 6 years in prison there because I wanted to go to college, and it was one of the last remaining college programs. By the time I was finished with that conversation about that very personal human experience, the senator was leaning forward. His staff was leaning forward. They were listening. They were interested. And we didn't solve anything in that room, in that space. But the same way that correctional counselor planted a seed in me that grew into a tree that he doesn't enjoy the shade of today is the same way one might argue that Senator Sessions someday may remember that conversation with me about how a real human interaction was able to set my life in a totally different direction. So I try to plant seeds. In fact, one of my things here that I was going to recommend, one of my pledges in 10 weeks was to tell people that you should spend some time planting seeds. Not everyone's going to stand on the steps of City Hall or even send an email to the governor and so on, but you can do what that correctional counselor did for me, which was to plant a seed and just hope that seed's going to grow.
As I make my way to the next question, do you, Gina, want to share one of your... Did you write down a commitment that you would love for folks to consider? Or,
yeah,
Deanna, either of you write down a commitment? And if anyone wants to put a hand in the air, I'll make my way in that direction while we hear from Gina. This is a close one right here. Go ahead, Gina.
So I think that a commitment that I would invite from people is an investment in your political education. And I guess that what I mean by that is that I think I realized at a certain point that while I learned about kind of just the basics in school about how social change happens, it really wasn't a thorough course or understanding that I developed. And I think that that's a problem. If we want to create social change, we should really understand it. We should look at other contexts and other social movements. We should understand the root causes of the things that we're trying to fight. And I think one of the things that I would really I think push people to do is to broaden a lens from racism and the racial caste system to include patriarchy. Patriarchy was something I always say I became aware of my blackness before I became aware of my womanness, and that's not saying because I was a little girl before I would, that's because the way that I was educated was around race, that we learned about Martin Luther King and somewhat about Malcolm X, although that probably didn't happen until college, but I never understood the way in which patriarchy is manifesting as a real operator to allow the conditions that we are all facing today to exist and persist, and the way in which our patriarchal understandings are intervening with our theories of change. And so for me, those things became it was this huge aha moment, and something that I'm committing myself to over the next year and beyond is to be even a more diligent student of social change theory, of patriarchy, of capitalist critiques, because all of these things are interwoven. And if you're only operating from one, then you're probably missing a lot in the way that you're approaching issues and the way that you're understanding problems that you wish to approach.
Deanna, let me take this woman here who has not only filled out her commitment card, but has filled out a whole notebook of commitments. You don't mind my telling the room that, do you? All right, here. Why don't you take them? I'll hold the mic for you because you're holding that notebook.
Okay.
And tell us who you are.
So my name is Liz Quadrado. I'm actually an interior designer in Manhattan. And so I was very interested when I heard about your work, Deanna. And so I guess it's more of a two-part question, but for these these restorative peacemaking spaces, what is the concept that you draw from for that? If there were previous, spaces that existed, or just what does it boil down to? I'm so super fascinated. And then also the other thing is more of like the implementation. I apologize. I don't know if this too much about the work. Literally, I just learned about it today. But how difficult has it been difficult to bring these spaces in? I guess, do they exist in prisons? And when we look at private prisons, is it more of an issue, on that end, because it's different, a different way of thinking? But anyways, yeah, I guess it's concept and implementation.
I can try to be brief. I'm speaking at the Cooper Hewitt Museum on Thursday about all this, so you just come. I'll speak for a whole 30 minutes.
She made a note already.
So yeah, what I started to look at a lot was Native American peacemaking practices and indigenous justice globally as a solution, and as a viable solution before the European model. So the model we have now is new. Restorative justice is old, right? It's in our bones. It makes sense with us as human beings. It just really deeply resonates for me. So I also got trained as a circle keeper and a peacekeeper so that I could start to run circles in communities. So that through the development and implementation of the space, we also had people learning how to be in a cultural practice like that. What does it mean to be in a circle and to really share? And how do we create environments that actually facilitate that? Where should they be? What should they look like? We are going to break ground on our first restorative justice, restorative economic center this summer. It's taken 5-6 years. From the little idea in my head, it's oh my God, I'm freaking out. It's amazing. It's amazing. And it has been difficult, right? It's difficult to fund. Glenn and I had talked briefly about it's just difficult to get it in as a practice. We're very committed to punishment in this structure that's existed now and is so deeply embedded. When I talk about architecture, prisons literally manifest the values of punishment and retribution. So the spaces that we're looking at are actually in communities. They're either we took a crack house and turned it into a peacemaking center. They need to be in our schools. They need to be in every housing development. These spaces need to be totally decentralized and be created by the communities. When they come, they can see themselves in it. And we just learned some, as designer, practical things on what those spaces should look like and what they need, right? How do you manage fight or flight, right? When you come into a dialogue with somebody, your heart rate goes up, you freak out. These are just environmental psychology issues that we've also looked at. So together, I think we're going to be able to make a lot of these spaces.
Okay. Really not bad. Okay, I'm gonna try and squeeze in these last two, and then I promised Jennifer, who runs this place, that I would ask.
Okay, thank you. I'm Ralph Tamlin, and I claim...
Ralph, I'm stepped on you. Please say your name again.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ralph Tamlin. I claim complete ignorance of the wonderful things you're doing, so forgive me. And I found that story about the little girl to be stunning, really moving. So my commitments are that I want to write within 10 days to Deanna to learn more about these peacemaking centers, because I think that's very innovative. And I want to write to my state legislator in 10 weeks to ask why some of our corrections budget can't be spent on some of the things you're talking about, which I think complements what these two
please.
Are doing.
Tax dollars to peacemaking.
I hate to say it, but it always takes some money to make change. And so that's what it is. And so thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacob. Thank you for speaking. You're really all truly inspiring. I work at an amazing organization in New York called the Bronx Freedom Fund that I urge everyone to check out. And it's an organization that pays people's bail in the Bronx to get them out of the web of mass incarceration that really bail functions as such of a crux for. And I noticed that you spoke about a bail program that you're implementing, Gina. And I guess especially in the wake of Governor Cuomo's proposals that was released on Sunday, and assuming that most of the people in this room are New Yorkers, I was just wondering if some of you could speak to how individuals in the room could perhaps get involved in bail reform related initiatives and just how bail functions as a crux for the criminal justice system, because it's something that as an organization we often run up against people just not even understanding what it is, how it functions, and how integral it is to the functioning of mass incarceration.
Yeah, bail is big. Actually, before Essie Justice Group, I thought maybe I would start an organization called Bail Broads. Didn't happen. But in the course of understanding, and this was because this was the issue, one of the issues that kept on coming up was that the bail industry and the bail system, and I talk about those as two separate things, right? You have the private industry of bail agents and the surety providers that kind of back them up, that are making lots and lots of money, and then you have the bail system, which provides certain types of legal requirements in terms of, a judge's ability or discretion to allow someone released prior to trial. The system is a mess, and I know I know the Bronx Freedom Fund is a phenomenal project that has been going on and not just directly serving individuals, but also inspiring change in policy and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what we need. Bail is a big issue in this country. And I think a way that if you want to get involved in a particular issue, first of all, if you're in New York, you need to be in the Rikers campaign. Go join what JustLeadershipUSA is doing. Bail is also a national conversation. In California, there are 2 bills that are that have been introduced that Essie Justice Group is co-sponsoring in this legislative term to end the use of money bail in California. And we see, systemic change as really necessary, and legal change and change through legislation as being necessary to ending the use of money bail. But those types of projects are also really important. I would also point out that the Movement for Black Lives has an incredible policy agenda that you can find by going to the Movement for Black Lives policy, just Google it, and you can look and you can choose from a variety of issues to get involved in, and many of them are focused on criminal justice, and they have brilliant solutions, one of which focuses on bail, and I'll be a part of a national conversation with that policy table in about a week as well. And so bail is big. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a really exciting opportunity to make change, and so I think that if any of your commitments have bail written in them, then you're on the right track.
Can I just tie that question back to the Close Rikers campaign? What percentage of people you bail out end up showing up and don't run it?
96%.
So 96% of people who have no skin in the game, right? They get bailed out by this initiative, end up returning back to court. And yet on Rikers, when I was on Rikers, there were 22,000 people. Today there are 8,000. So in my mind, it gives us a tremendous opportunity to do something. But let me say something about those 8,000 people to help define it for you. Because people are like, how do you close Rikers and what do you do with the 8,000 people? The head of the Department of Correction often says, quote unquote, half the people who show up at Rikers don't need to be here. You know why? Because 50% of the population leaves every 3 to 10 days. Why? Because there are people with low-level crimes who are there with low amounts of bail, who are poor and who can't get the bail together, and who sit there and lose their jobs, lose their housing, lose their access to education, and are just further criminalized. So when people say to me, how do you close Rikers? To be quite frank, if you were to figure out either how to get judges to pay attention to a bail statute that could actually work if they had the courage to use the many different provisions that exist besides just cash bail or secured bond, or 2, change the statute and force judges to use these other mechanisms. And so if you look at my Daily News op-ed from a few days ago, that got me to the point where apparently the governor is a little bit upset, which is a good place to be for an advocate. I think the problem is not whether or not we do something about bail, but it's whether this governor who has said we need to do something follows through. He has been very unwilling to spend the capital it takes to take any progressive criminal justice initiatives to the finish line. And so that's what people in this room can do, is recognize that just because a person holds themselves out as progressives and says all the right things doesn't mean we don't need to hold them accountable and responsible to getting to the finish line. And so as you look at your list of things you're going to try to accomplish, we logged 17,000 tweets to Mayor de Blasio to close down Rikers in the last week and a half. I'd love for you guys to add to that. That's something you could do in the next 10 minutes. Forget about the next 10 days. But just one last quick story. Yesterday evening, we showed up at a fundraiser that de Blasio was having, and it was a great moment, one of multiple moments we've been creating to help the mayor understand that we're not going away and that this movement is growing. And he showed up finally, and he put his hand on the shoulder of one of our formerly incarcerated leaders. And I think he was doing like the political Jedi mind trick. He was sort of trying to get him to change his message. And he said to him, we're all on the same page. Even if we don't close Rikers, we'll make it safer and we'll reduce the population and so on. And it was the most proud moment I've ever had, where the leader looked him right in the face and said, "No, Mr. Mayor, we're going to close Rikers Island." And so if that person, that formerly incarcerated man, probably making a little bit above minimum wage, probably housing unstable and everything else that comes with having a criminal record in this country and in this city, can stand up and say that to our mayor, what's the responsibility of the people in this room who have a tremendous amount of privilege to spend your privilege by standing alongside people who are less privileged?
I feel like we should flash mob. All right, so I did not hear, it was my fault because I took us off the path, but your commitment on the card. Did you want to ask folks?
Or the commitment
well,
I'm
we could hear.
for?
It's the commitment you're asking for, okay. Unless you want to share your commitment. But it's really the commitment you're asking the folks in this room to make to help move your cause forward.
So I think my commitment is just easy, actually, but also really hard. I did this exercise a few years ago where I spent one day tracking my mind and my thoughts and the judgments I had about others all around me. Everything from their race to what they were wearing, their size of their body, what their hair looked like. And I was able to start to build an awareness of how I project hatred and prejudice and bigotry and judgment onto others, and that I think is a core piece that exacerbates a lot of the problems we have. I also had a sensation where I felt my heart opening, like I actually felt a physiological change in my body around how I could see how I was bigoted and prejudiced towards certain groups of people and certain things, and I had no idea.
Now wait, when you say you tracked,
I just watched my thoughts all day. Try it. Just try it. That's what I'm asking you to do. Just try it for a day. Just watch your mind. Just watch it. Watch what it says to you, the inner dialogue. Oh my God, she's so ugly. What did she do? I mean, you can just watch it. It goes. And don't act like you don't do it yourself, because you do. You do. And I saw a really ugly part of myself. And I had a conversation with last night with a guy who was like, I'm not racist. I don't see that. That doesn't happen to me. I'm like, spend a day, watch your thoughts. Because in that inner investigation is where it really begins. It begins with yourself, with your own inner landscape. What's happening inside of there? What's happening in your mind? How are you pushing it out into the world? It's insidious, and I do believe it is a core problem, and it'll only take you one day. Okay, it's all day, but it's not, just try it and see what happens.
That's a beautiful, beautiful thing to do. Were you exhausted at the end of the day?
I was shocked. I will not reveal my prejudice. I never tell people what I was thinking.
See, I'm just projecting that I would be exhausted, but I'm not saying anything about you.
It's shock. It can be shock. It's a real surprise.
It's a
real surprise. An opportunity to grow.
Great idea, people. So that's the commitment you're asking for us to all engage in this exercise.
Yeah, and you can do that in the next 10 days. Just do it this year, maybe, is at least. But try it. See what happens.
Okay, that is a beautiful way. I was going to ask everybody for a summary statement, but I think that's a beautiful way to end with that. That is an open-hearted request of everyone in this room. I'm going to call someone out. Cheryl Dorsey, stand up now. It's dark back there. This is Cheryl Dorsey. She's the president of Echoing Green. Give it up. Give it up. Oh, they put the lights up. They put the lights up for you. Cheryl, we are so honored and pleased to have you here tonight. Thank you for this organization. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for all you have done. If people didn't know it before they came here tonight, they certainly know it now. Echoing Green is making such a contribution in the world. What is it, 700 people strong? When I found out, I heard about Echoing Green pretty much when it was founded. And I said, whoa, really? Has it been that long? Cheryl Dorsey?
30 years.
Okay, you didn't have to say
I know. Sorry, Jamie. I'm dating both of us, right?
You are, but I am so proud to have known you
Same
all
here.
of this time.
Thank you for hosting these extraordinary
Thank you for
leaders. Thank
bringing
you.
them to us, and
Thank
it's
you.
an honor to have you with us tonight.
Thank
Cheryl
you.
Dorsey, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks.
And so I want to thank Echoing Green for partnering with us on Solutions Week. Thank you to the sponsors of tonight's event, including, of course, the Jerome L. Green Foundation, HIG Capital, and Audible.com. We have 2 more events this week. Tomorrow we're going to talk about racial equity in healthcare. And on Thursday we're going to explore innovative pathways to employment here in New York and the surrounding areas. Thank you, Gina Clayton, Glenn Martin, Deanna Van Buren, for your inspirations, your optimism, and your challenges for our commitments. We appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight and for your commitments to make this world a better place. Have a good evening.